evening and a warm welcome to the annual budget discussion titled From Rupees to Reality Live Through the 2024 Budget. This is organized by the Economic Students Association of the University of Colombo in collaboration with the Sri Lanka Association for Political Economy. Today, we have three esteemed lineup of panelists today to give us an insight onto this very contemporary topic that not only affects just the policy, but also affects all of us as a whole. With that, while we had promised 4 panelists for the discussion through our publications, I would also like to take this opportunity to mention that Dr. Amali Vedagedara, who was supposed to join the panel today, is unable to make it due to an unforeseen circumstance. However, we are assuring you a very informative discussion today, and we do apologize for any inconvenience that was caused in the process. Without further ado, to commence today's proceedings, I would like to invite the President of the Students Association, Shihara Pereira, to deliver the welcome address. Over to you, Shihara.
Hello, everyone. A very good afternoon, all of you. So, distinguished guest, esteemed panelist, Head of the Department of Economics, University of Colombo, Professor Chandana Aludge, all the lecturers, fellow students, and all interested in the future of Sri Lanka's economy. On behalf of the Economic Student Association of the University of and in collaboration Sri Lanka Association for Political Economy, I welcome to this vital discussion on the 2024 budget proposals. As students of economics, we understand the profound impact budgets have on the lives of every citizen. From education and healthcare to infrastructure and economic growth, the allocation of resources shapes our reality. Today, we embark on a journey to demystify the proposed budget, analyze its potential impact, and engage in a constructive dialogue about its role in shaping a budget for Sri Lanka. We are honored to be joined by a distinguished panel of experts, Senior Professor Sirimal Abeyratne, Department of Economics, University of Colombo, Mr. Chayu Damsinghe, Head of Macroeconomic, Risk Advisory, Frontier Research, Mr. Pathirana, Economist and author. We are pleased to introduce Mr. Vibhath Jayasinghe, an undergraduate student from the Department of Economics, University of Colombo, who will be moderating today's discussion. Throughout this discussion, we aim to achieve the following objectives. Increase awareness. Many citizens lack a comprehensive understanding of the budget and its implications. We aim to bridge this gap by providing accessible and informative discussion. Analyze the impact. We will find into the potential effects of the budget on various sectors, including education, healthcare, agriculture, and trade and industry. Spark dialogue. We encourage open and respectful debate, fostering critical thinking and engagement with the budgetary process. Empower action. Understanding the budget impact, we can hold our leaders accountable and contribute to shaping a more equitable and prosperous Sri Lanka. This discussion is not merely an academic exercise. It is an opportunity for us to collectively engage with the future of our nation. We invite each of you to actively participate, ask questions, and share your thoughts. Together, let us translate rupees into reality by building a prosperous and inclusive Sri Lanka. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shihara, for that warm introduction to what the budget discussion today is all about. With that in mind, next up, we have a very special individual joining us today, whose support and guidance for the team continues to be immeasurable. So without further ado, I would like to invite the head of the Department of Economics here at the University of Colombo, Professor Chandana Aludge, to address the gathering. Over to you, Professor. Professor Chandana, are you here with us? Right, okay.
Yes. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm sorry, I'm in my vehicle right now because the department was closed, and then I came out. Uh, uh, so it is very interesting. I remember some time ago, I think last year, our student association actually organized the same type of discussion about the budget at that time, last year or maybe year before. And I could see a few familiar faces in the panel of discussants. So this is very timely discussion. Debate is going on, and the weekend there was a hurdle to whether to say yes or no to the VAT tax proposal, and I thought the title "From Rupees to Reality" is it's a very catchy title, and it actually, as soon as I saw the email, my inquisity aroused in order to because of the title to join and listen to the speakers, and on behalf of the Department of Economics, actually together with our Economic Students Association, we would like to welcome and thank all our panel members or discussants, especially Senior Professor Sirimal Abeyratne joining this discussion. He has vast amount of experience and expertise in macroeconomics. So I think all of us can learn new things from his listening to his analysis. And my friend Danusha is also there, and thank you very much, Danusha, and the other discussants. We extend our gratefulness to all of you, and wish all of you good luck to have a very nice, interesting discussion in this evening. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Professor, for that warm address as well. Now we move on to the much awaited segment for this evening, which is actually the panel discussion. To start things off and to formally introduce the panelists to us, we have with us our very own moderator, Vibhath Jayasinghe of the Department of Economics, to actually take over the proceedings today. So over to you, Vibhath.
Thank you very much, Shihara. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, can someone kindly confirm if I am both visible and audible?
Yes to both.
Brilliant. All right. Once again, let me take a moment to welcome you all to today's event, organized by the Economic Students Association of the University of Colombo, in collaboration with the Sri Lanka Association for Political Economy, From Rupees to Reality, live through the 2024 budget. My name is Vibhath Jayasinghe, and I will be the moderator of today's session. Now, one can argue and say that the national budget acts as a blueprint of sorts, one that undoubtedly gives an idea of the trajectory of a nation's development. Why? Because it showcases how public financial resources will be utilized for the effective delivery of public goods and selected services that assist in achieving development objectives laid out by the government. Therefore, the way in which the national budget is allocated among the various sectors of a country is of prime importance. However, don't take it from me. No, don't do that, because we have with us a few special individuals who are much more knowledgeable in this matter to share their thoughts on this topic. As such, as previously mentioned, we have the esteemed privilege of introducing to you not one, not two, but three panelists who are well-versed in their areas of expertise to share their wisdom with us today. And thus, for this reason, as previously established by my good friends Shihara and Shihara, we will have with us Senior Professor Sirimal Abeyratne, Mr. Danush Pathirana, and Mr. Chayu Damsinghe. Our dear panelists, we are ecstatic and truly grateful to have you all with us here today. However, before we introduce and hear from our panelists, let me start by providing everyone with an outline of today's proceedings. Now, this event will be comprised of three primary sections, or sessions more rather. The first session will see our panelists give their initial thoughts and introduce the prominent points of their views on the topic at hand, with each speaker having a total of 15 minutes. After the four initial speeches are done, we will then enter the second session, where each panelist will be able to perhaps comment on the views expressed by their fellow panelists, provide any additional information regarding their views if they wish, but ultimately to provide a stance on the matter at hand. Finally, to cap off this event, we will then transition into a dedicated question and answer session, where you, the audience, can pose your questions to our panelists and clarify any doubts or queries that you may have. Feel free to send in your questions through the chat box to the Zoom participants titled Question 1 and Question 2, which you can find on the Participants tab here on the Zoom application. Or, however, if you feel comfortable enough to vocalize it, well, you are more than welcome to. Please use the raise hand option, however, that is available to you. And if we recognize and give you the green light to speak, at that point in time, unmute your mic and pose your question. If you are sending in your questions through the chat box, feel free to do so right throughout the event, and we will eventually get to them during our question and answer session. And please mention if you would like a specific panelist's view on the question, or if you would like to pose it to all three of them. However, if you plan to vocalize your question, please be kind enough to wait until we reach the Q&A segment of this event before you do so. Now, a few things to keep in mind as we proceed to the next phase of this session. Our dear panelists, this is for you. Once your speech starts, once again, you will have 15 minutes to share your thoughts. We will issue reminders of the amount of time remaining via the chat box. The first will be issued after 10 minutes, the second after 14, and the third once you elapse the given 15 minutes. Finally, a kind reminder to everyone in the audience. Please do not disturb or interrupt the speakers while they are making their speeches. All right. I believe I've spoken long enough. I am well aware that those in the attendance did not come here to hear me speak. So let us start by hearing from our panelists. To kick off the discussion, however, I'd like to take a moment to introduce someone who is very near and dear to all of us here at the University of Colombo, someone who has been a pillar of support to us here at the university through and through. You all know him. He is, of course, Senior Professor Sirimal Abeyratne. Now, Professor Abeyratne is the current chairman of the Monetary Policy Consultative Committee at the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. He previously held the position of head of the Department of Economics at the University of Colombo, Faculty of Arts. His educational background includes a PhD from the Free University of Amsterdam, along with a Master of Arts and a Master of Philosophy degrees from the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, and he has obtained his bachelor's degree from the University of Colombo. With a diverse academic and professional background, Professor Abeyratne has contributed significantly to his field. He has also served as a visiting fellow at universities in Japan, Vietnam, Australia, and in Italy. Professor, it is always a pleasure to have you with us. With that being said, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vibhath. Also, thank you, Shahara and all the officials of the Economic Students Association, all the organizers, and thank you for this opportunity that you have given me to share my thoughts about the budget 2024. I think that when I look at the budget, I think that is rather a premature budget. I would have seen it not now, but in a couple of years to come, maybe about 5 years' time or even 10 years' time. It's a very comfortable budget as it appears, and also it starts with the Buddhist concept reporting as balanced living and balance in the sense that you earn and you spend in a balanced way. But when we look at the economic reality of the country, when we translate rupees to reality, are we really permitted to have that kind of comfortable budget? It's the main question that I have to ask you. The reason is Sri Lanka is in an economic crisis, and for 3 years it has been there more or less, and last year deep down there. I know that it has come out of the ICU, but still it is in the patient's ward receiving long-term treatment. And in terms of long-term, I would not expect it to come out of the problem within a year or two. I would say that we have to treat chronic diseases that Sri Lanka has been undergoing, Sri Lanka has been nurturing, and deterioration of our immunity. With all that, it might take about 5 to 10 years time more to at least to come back to where we were before the crisis, that means 2019. So on the other hand, it is not enough. Recovery is not enough. Recovery and beyond recovery should be our aim. Beyond recovery means the progress after the recovery. So there are two stages of progress. One is the recovery, and second is the progress beyond recovery. So when we look at these couple of things, in fact, we need about 5 to 10 years to see the result. So in this situation, I consider the budget 2024 as a premature one. I would expect it kind of a budget to see in another 5 years' time, not today. Why do I say that? You have seen its welfare orientation, its salary hikes, and its subsidies, and all kinds of welfare expenditure in the budget. I understand perfectly. Nobody has to argue with me about the need of the people to have that kind of salary hikes and subsidies and supports at this level. I fully understand that. But the country is in a crisis. So how do we support people to in a crisis? Because we know that the citizens of this country, they are burdened with the increased prices. Their real income, more than 50–60%, has been wiped out during the last 1 year or so. The new prices, the fuel prices, energy prices are skyrocketing. The taxes affect those who are being taxed, and it squeezed their incomes further. So with all these things, and the people who have saved money, people who have got their retirement. So in fact, all the people lose forever what they have lost, and they have lost it forever, because that's the nature of crisis. Because why do I say that? The other people, younger people, they have enough time to go back to work and to make adjustments to their earnings and expenditure, and to experience the recovery and progress. So, but the older people, retired people, they don't have that opportunity. So what they have lost is lost for the lifetime. So with that note, let me highlight a couple of important numbers that I have noticed from this budget. Then we can understand why I say that it's a premature budget. Revenue is estimated to be little above 4,000 billion. 4,000 billion. But when you look at the expenditure, 2/3 of that expenditure is required, that revenue is required for interest payments, for previous borrowings. So once you have allocated that 2/3, you cannot cut it down. Then what is left is only 1/3 of the government revenue for each and everything, to give you salary hikes, to increase subsidies, and to provide public investment expenditure. And also there's a new expenditure item, which is the recapitalizing the banks. So with all these things, only what is left out of the government revenue is 1/3. So how to meet that revenue? With that revenue, this kind of expenditure, this kind of salary hikes and subsidy hikes and all these welfare-oriented expenditure expansion is a critical point. Now, let's look at the expenditure side also. Nearly 7,000 billion has been estimated to be the expenditure for the coming year. So I said that revenue is just about 4,000 billion. Now the expenditure is close to 7,000 billion. So there's a 3,000 gap already. But this does not include our, we have to pay our debt after restructuring. And so there is an estimate that we need to pay principal plus the interest payments. So the budget highlights in its current expenditure the interest payment. What about the principal, the capital payment? It is estimated to be for this year, the coming year, a little above 4,000 billion. In fact, it is higher than the total revenue of the government. The debt amortization, what we call it, or the capital payment. So which means that the total revenue of the government is not even enough to pay the capital part of the borrowings that we have to meet in the coming year. Total expenditure 7,000 billion, and only in both. Now, with that, obviously, there should be new borrowings. So we are in this crisis situation partly because of heavy borrowings. I would like to ask each and everyone that is present here and that is maybe out there. And when I go to a discussion about economic crisis, I usually pose this question to them, telling that if there is anybody here who is not responsible for the current crisis, please raise your hand. In fact, there is nobody. So blaming the politicians is only half truth. And we should also blame ourselves. If we haven't pumped petrol at lower price, lower than their world market price, if we have used our electricity at lower than the cost of production, if we have not compelled the government, if we not to borrow anymore. In fact, I have never seen any protest by trade unionists or activists or student activists or any kind of lobbying groups. I have never seen a protest against borrowings. But I have seen so many protests against investment, against businesses. In fact, there have been so many closed down events also, the business ventures as well as the potential investments, and potential investors were turned back with the protest. So we all know that we are part of the crisis and we are responsible, each one of us, we are responsible for this crisis because we have received the benefits from the government budget or outside the budget, and those benefits came from borrowings but we never protested against those borrowings. Even if it comes from borrowings, we were happy at that time. So the current situation is now, you can understand, there is no balancing in that budget, even though at the outset, the budget speech speaks about balanced living. So the new borrowing has to be, according to the estimate, 7,350 billion. 7,350 billion. So we have a borrowing limit, self-imposed borrowing limit in the government that is up to now, up to this year, it was 3,900 billion. Now that borrowing limit has been increased to 7,300 billion. But again, there are restrictions. Now you cannot borrow as the way that you did before the crisis. Why not? Central bank cannot print money as the way that they printed earlier and then participated in primary auction and buying the government securities and then giving money to the treasury. No, central bank, according to the new Central Bank Act, there is a limit now. But anyway, in the years to come, the central bank will not provide credit support to the government to meet the budgetary obligation, so that there is already cut down. Now, second problem, from 2007 onwards until 2019, we issue ISBs, International Sovereign Bonds, and then we got into this foreign debt crisis, foreign debt trouble. But now nobody is going to give us money, except those multilateral lenders like the World Bank, IMF, ADB, these kind of multilateral international lenders would give us some budgetary support. And in fact, this year also they gave us, and next year they will provide us. So only multilateral borrowings may be available, and some such arrangements may be available with China or India. And other than that, the only borrowing source seems to be the local, the domestic market borrowings. Now, with that, I think we have to increase that. We have already raised the borrowing limit to meet those expenditures. And then my question is, are we trying to get out of the crisis, or are we still postponing it? Obviously, there are two sides of the problem, but which side you choose? That's the question. Some may choose, no, doesn't matter whether it's borrowing or not, we must increase salaries, we must increase subsidies, we are dying and our income, we are lost and prices are 2-3 times higher now. We should have relief from the budget. That is part of the argument. Other argument is, no, it's the nature of the crisis. We are almost dying, but we should get out of this crisis. Even for our children, we should take the country out of this crisis, no matter if we die in this crisis, but we should look at our children, our young generation, so that we should cut down expenditure, we should increase income, tax income, and then we should support the recovery and progress. That is the other side. And the choice is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor. We are very grateful for your insight on the matter. And we are certain that it will be a catalyst for some fruitful discussion in our coming second session. Moving on, ladies and gentlemen, we have with us another individual, a talented economist and author, one whose opinions and views will no doubt be very enlightening and additive to what we already know about the national budget. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Danush Pathirana. Now, Mr. Pathirana is an experienced professional based in Sri Lanka and has worked as a senior economic analyst at Asia Capital PLC. There, he has brought a wealth of experience gained from significant roles in respected institutions. Having previously worked at 1857 Advisors, Asia Securities Private Limited, LBR Sri Lanka, and Partners South Asia, he has accumulated a diverse and comprehensive background in economic analysis and corporate strategy. Now, his academic research includes the successful completion of Masters in Economics from the University of Colombo. His expertise includes journalism, social media management, public relations, corporate communications, and economic development, of course. He is also the co-author of a book named A History of Underdevelopment and Political Economy in Sri Lanka, with an outline of nationalism. With that being said, Mr. Pathirana, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me. And congratulations to all the organizers and the Economic Association, the Political Economic Association of Sri Lanka, and also the Economic Students Association of Colombo University. And again, thanks a lot for having me and giving me the opportunity. So I've been given 5 areas to focus on the 2024 budget. So I'll initially stick to that, and maybe in the second round, I'll express more general views about the budget and how it would impact the broader economy and so on. Sorry, excuse me about my health situation. So initially, I'll speak about these government workers' salaries, which the organizers requested me to reflect on, and also the welfare schemes and the SMEs and the land reforms, and also the development projects that are mentioned in the budget. So if I may start on the workers' salaries. Now, even Professor Sirimal Abeyratne expressed his concerns about the increase in the salaries and wages of the government workers. But just to start off in a contradictory view, now if we look at, we have to look at the workers' salaries, especially when it comes to government salaries, in 2 respects. One, I think, in a relatively according to how other line items in the budget is proposed to get funding through government revenue and expenditure, and also in absolute terms, how this would how the salaries and wages would fare in the context of taxation and inflation. So first of all, if I look at how much an increase is, what is the type of increase that we are expecting from the 2024 budget for salaries, this is somewhere around 14% increase. So 10,000 rupee monthly increase would come to about 14% increase, and the total wage bill will be around 1.1 trillion. So if I touch on the relative aspect of this increase, now we have to also look at what because now I know this has been like repeatedly said that the salaries and wages are destabilizing governments or what we call the fiscal stability, because that has been considered or like framed as a burden, which is the center of fiscal instability in the government. But contrarily, I should say, now, just as Professor Sirimal Abeyratne sort of raised, the interest component, we have to look at that. Now, this has increased some around 160% over the last 2-3 years. So, and the ratio between salaries of the government workers and the interest payments was roughly around 1-to-1 until around 2020, 2021. So, for instance, the government workers were given, the total wage bill was around 1 trillion, whereas interest payments was around the same amount. So 1-to-1 ratio. Whereas now we see in the 2024 budget, the interest payments have increased to close to 2.7 trillion or 2,651 billion rupees. Now, this is an increase from around 5% of the GDP in 2021 to 8.4% of the GDP. So roughly almost 10%, 1/10 of the GDP is going into interest payments. Whereas if you take the salaries and wages, this has been stagnating over a period. and now given roughly a 14% increase by increasing their salaries by around 10,000 rupees or 10,000 rupees per month. And so that was the, in short, the relative situation, whereas the interest cost.
Mr. Dhanusha, you are on mute.
Sorry, okay, I'm not on mute now. Yeah, no, I've got a call. So yeah, so I was saying 94 to 95% of the interest expenditure is going to domestic interest payments. Now we know government launched a domestic debt restructuring program to reduce this component. Now this is exactly why, because Sri Lanka is the world's #1 when it comes to the ratio of interest payments to government revenue, which is 77%, not in fact more than 2/3 what Professor Sirimal said, 77%. Second in line is Ghana, it's 44%. And you see that the yawning gap between the second in line and the first in line. First in line is Sri Lanka. So we have become the world's #1 when it comes to paying interest. And all of that, most of that is going to domestic interest payments. So DDR should have actually brought down that now interest component. It did not happen because they just targeted the workers, EPF and ETF, which did not buy this. So which did not buy most of the high cost bonds which were issued in 2022 and 2023, which if we have time, we can talk about that later. So, and moving on to the absolute value of these wages. Now, this will deteriorate more than what the rate of increase of the wages, because the government is now expecting a 47% increase in revenue and 62% of increase in the indirect taxation. So when you say 47%, the marginal increase is about 1.2 trillion. That works out to about 13,500 per each worker, considering there's about 8 billion workers in Sri Lanka. So that shows that the salary increase will be actually, in real terms, it will be negative, even if you disregard the high inflation, which happened due to the collapse of the currency in 2022 and 2023. So even disregarding that inflationary erosion of real wages, we will see a complete wipeout of the real value of this salary increase because of the expected increase in the taxes. And most of that is going to come through indirect taxation, because government is expecting a 62% increase from the goods, the taxes on goods and services. So, which would mean that the direct to indirect ratio of taxation. Now, this has been sort of repeatedly highlighted by the experts that we should have a more progressive tax ratio where income taxes should be contributing more, and inflationary taxes, which are indirect taxes, should not be contributing so much to government revenue. But the reverse is the plan of this the government budget. So it's a completely regressive budget that is designed to extract as much as possible from the average citizenry, whereas this ratio will be going up from 67 to 72%. So which is inflation. So it will eat up into the salaries and wages, which are already have been eroded and slashed due to inflation. So we can discuss about that, I think, probably in the second round and later. So secondly, I'll say something about Aswasuma and basically in general about the social safety expenditure that is planned in this budget. So as we know, the IMF condition was that government should at least allocate somewhere around 0.6% of the budget or the GDP as social security spending. So this comes to roughly around 180 billion rupees. So what we see is that the total social security spending roughly equals this amount. So they basically used that ratio as a ceiling to allocate government resources to social security. But what we have to see is that the extent of the humanitarian crisis that we are facing in terms of poverty and absolute indebtedness among the lower income earning strata of the country, and destitution, which is revealed by the recent research that have been done by institutions like the UN, UNDP, and the World Bank. The World Bank stated that our poverty ratio is around 25%, which is to say that 1/4 of the population is under the poverty level. So, and also the UNDP in September put out a report highlighting that the multi-dimensional vulnerability of Sri Lanka is as high as 56% of the population. So it has 12 indicators, including health, education, nutrition, and the security level. That is to say, if there's economic uncertainty or economic external shocks, how that would impact their incomes, whether they are secured by that. So all that is included. So 56% of the population are below that, greater than the, which is the majority. And also to say North and East is as high as 65%, North and East provinces, and including districts like Puttlam and so on. So as we see, this social security spending is not even close to sufficient levels. So just to show that on the surface level that they have increased, but sorry about that. But this is nowhere enough to address the humanitarian situation or the crisis situation we are right now ongoing. I don't know whether we have even sufficiently realized how bad the situation is. I'll move on to the next section, which is the focus on the SMEs. Now, what we see is that we can, I think, look at this issue from three areas. One is that the allocation is around 50 billion. But that how that 50 billion is allocated, whether it is addressing the problems in the SME sector. So one we should highlight is that this unelected president in his budget speech, he himself highlighted that 20% of the SMEs have already closed down. And we know SMEs contribute to around 50% of the GDP and 45% of the employment. So when 20% of the SMEs have already wiped out, that means from the SME sector alone, national unemployment rate would increase to up to around 10%. And now with this proposed taxation of VAT and also extending that to things like electricity, the public utilities, water, the cost of production will further increase, and this will have again a more contractionary detrimental effect on the SMEs. While showing that they are allocating 50 billion without specifying how exactly they are going to address the issues in the SME sector, which I don't know whether I have time to raise, but at the surface level, I can just say that the budget will be aggravating these problems while when the tax measures are implemented in 2024, when the year begins, because their production costs will increase, which will translate into further SME closures and further aggravating the unemployment and the output problem, which will not just affect the SMEs, it will escalate into the more large-scale manufacturing sector, which is, we know it is labor-intensive, which is not conducive for economic transformation, which I don't have the time to explain now. So, and also I should say a little bit about the structure of the SMEs. Now, there was an import substituting industrialization process that was centered on high-tech SMEs in South Korea, Taiwan, and also in Japan. which played a key role in the economic transformation. So the question I'm raising is whether this 50 billion is trying to transform them technologically in producing, in becoming the foundation of Sri Lanka's industrialization. Nothing like that, no planning, nothing like that in the budget. So complete failure in that respect. So I think I only have something like 1 minute left. And about the land reforms, we see that they have allocated 300,000 acres essentially from the UDA and the Plantation Ministry and the Mahavali Authority. Now, if we leave out the UDA, Plantation Ministry and the Mahavali Authority, the land is already occupied, we know, and we don't know how exactly, whether there is any mechanism to allocate this land and how it would impact the environmental degradation that is already going on. One through deforestation, one through intensifying the human-elephant conflict, especially in the northern NCP, the North Central Province. So, so what we see is that both these environmental issues and okay, I'm getting flagged that my time is up. So I'll just quickly finish off. So by this proposal for land reforms, especially this 300,000 acres, this will further aggravate the environmental crisis we are already facing, and in terms of deforestation and the human-elephant conflict, which would mean furthermore lives are at stake, especially among the rural population in Sri Lanka. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pathirana, for that detailed explanation of your thoughts on the subject matter at hand. But we are not done quite yet, ladies and gentlemen, because next we have a very versatile economist and a good friend of the University of Colombo, I should add, an individual who has always made time to attend our events and share his thoughts and knowledge with everyone in the audience. He is, of course, none other than Mr. Chayu Damsinghe. Now, Mr. Damsinghe is currently the head of Macroeconomic Risk Advisory at Frontier Research. He leads work in understanding varying macroeconomic risks and tying them into the Sri Lankan economic context. He is currently focusing on debt crises in Sri Lanka and other countries, monetary and fiscal sector risks, and energy sector developments. He plays a key role in the development of Frontier's views on interest rates and the Sri Lankan rupee, and in presenting content to Frontier's clients. Moreover, he has been featured in various local and international media for his views on the economy. He also acts as an executive director for Daddy's Lanka Private Limited, a family-run institute working in the field of special needs and mental health care. Co-hosts, just a heads up, I believe Mr. Damsinghe has some slides that he would like to use. If the necessary permissions can be granted to him in order for him to share his screen, that would be greatly appreciated. With that being said, Mr. Damsinghe, it is wonderful to have you back once again. And with that, I'd like to pass it on to you.
Right. Thanks. I won't thank everyone individually. I am almost definitely going to leave someone out and offend that person immensely. So therefore, I will decide to offend everyone equally and just give general thanks for the invitation. I think the Professor Sirimal and Danush before me gave a relatively, I would say, diverse explanation of what's going on. So I will share some slides as well, like I said, to kind of substantiate some things that I do want to bring out and put a few data points into the discussion as well. I will, of course, start with, however, a little bit of a disclaimer. I hope the slides will be visible in a second. Let me see. Right. I have taken the liberty of lifting your title directly and just adding my name at the bottom. I hope that's not an issue. So I do want to start with a bit of a disclaimer because I am representing a firm, as in I work for a private sector firm. So I just want to have a disclaimer of where I'm coming from and what Frontier, as the firm I work for, does, what they don't do, and again, where my perspective on this will come from. In that, Frontier is a macro advisory firm, so we think about what can happen, try to describe the economy, scenario-based forecasts, but decision-making is what we really focus on. So I'm not going to do any of that here in terms of, we're not going to talk about the forecast of the economy or help you guys make decisions necessarily. I will just take a very descriptive approach of what I want to do. But I do want to point out what Frontier doesn't do, that we don't talk about what should be done or provide positive recommendations We don't manage money. We also don't try to promote policies in one way or the other that we think are good. It's very much a very descriptive basis, a descriptive approach we take as opposed to a prescriptive one. And within what I'm discussing here and whatever I discuss publicly, I want to give ahead that kind of description. As a disclaimer, I'm not talking about XYZ policy is good. I'm talking about XYZ is what's happening. Whenever I give a view of my own, I will very much flag it as a personal view and not necessarily a Frontier, because Frontier very much does not do that. Right, so I do want to talk a little bit on the numbers here, just to add some things there. I think a lot of the broad points were mentioned before, so I will keep the numbers up and maybe point to a few things and then take specific points of that I want to talk about, so as not to be repetitive. But this is a quote and something I'm quoting from the budget speech. This was an annexure to the budget. I think that's a great annexure. If someone hasn't read it at the end of the budget, that budget speech is there on the Treasury website, a brilliant one to read, to understand, if not the reality, at least how the government right now sees the crisis as having played out. And I'm talking about fiscal deficits being very much a problem in the past. But the fact that those fiscal deficits were met, they didn't boil over to crises like we're seeing right now, or like we saw recently, because government was able to borrow from foreign sources, was able to get loans from the state banks, and we were able to print money. And neither of those options are really available anymore. And I want to show two charts to show, particularly on this foreign financing and on central bank financing, the money printing side of things, the extent to how large this was in the past. What this chart shows is two types of money printing done by the central bank. In blue is what we call provisional advances that are given by the central bank to the government. In red is essentially when the central bank buys debt of the government. I'm not going to get into specifics of it, but you can see how since the 50s is when I have particular data for, and that has been incredibly high, 10, 15, to coming close to 20% of GDP in the 60s, once again in the late 70s, again in the late 80s, and the most recent example of that, of course, with COVID and the period after COVID, when there's all of this money printing that happened. So the point of this is that when there have been deficits in the past, when the government has needed to make expenditures in the past, a big way of how they did it was the government essentially printed money. And across these periods, as a result of this, we had the inflation repercussions of this. We had this in the 60s, we had it in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and of course, most recently as well. In this period in the middle where there isn't a lot of that, part of that is also because GDP grew due to foreign money. So I want to show an indication of how large foreign money itself was. We're here showing foreign loan inflows as well as foreign inflows into rupee securities. This does not include ISBs, because I want to show that even excluding ISBs, there was significant amount of foreign money coming into Sri Lanka from essentially it started in the late 80s, but and that was partly driven by a lot of global money printing effectively. So it's money printing locally and globally that has affected this. But that aside, the fact that there was a lot of foreign money coming in. And again, like Professor Sirimal said earlier, that's not really a mechanism we have access to. And the money printing is also a mechanism, like he said, we don't have access to anymore with the Central Bank Act, really putting a very strong stop on that. So one can argue whether those are good decisions or bad decisions, but that is in any case, the reality of the economy that we currently live in. And I'm quoting this from one of our reports that we sent out because I felt that was an apt summation of a lot of things. Is that there is increased expenditure, but there is also increased revenue that compensates for it. And that compared to earlier, where you could essentially have a free lunch in the economy, where you have to pay for the lunch later by borrowing, and you don't even have to pay the borrowing because you can borrow again later, all of that. It's not necessarily the case anymore. It's a paid lunch. Of course, the question and lots of discussion narratives, stories about that in the public is whether the people who are paying fairly, or is it a fair payment scheme, essentially, that is there. So I'm just going to take that as an overall kind of message and then go into a few data points. Again, a lot of the data points would have been already spoken of, particularly by Professor Sirimal. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on all of it. Just keep the data points up. Right. So this is in terms of revenue, both in terms of tax revenue and non-tax revenue. Non-tax revenue is just essentially fees and all of that, not a very large amount. The budget expects that to rise to the total to rise at about 13% of GDP in 2024, which is more than 2018's levels, but still significantly lower than what we've had in the past. Sri Lanka has had budget so rather revenue as a percentage of GDP up to I think the highest I can recall was somewhere in the 30s in the late 70s, I think it was. But then it has moved up and down since then. And since the late 90s has actually been on a relatively consistent downward trajectory. And this is essentially something that this budget, as a result of what we talked about, the mechanisms of running those deficits have been lower, trying to figure out a way to deal with it. The biggest increase is very much through VAT. And what this shows is the blue bit is VAT. There is also a little bit of, this is not the entirety of VAT, in that part of it is also related to the trade side of things as well, VAT on imports for that is. But there's a very large increase in VAT, that is very much part of it. But there's also a relatively significant increase in income taxes as well. And if you look at it, if you compare 2018-19, you are in fact getting a significantly more higher percentage of GDP in income tax revenue than you have in the past as well. I think where the government is forecasting 3.4% for 2024's, but in 2024's budget, which would be, as I recall, the highest income tax percentage since somewhere in the early 2000s. So it is still quite significant. Of course, it's nowhere near, the kind of progressive, 50-50 or 40-60 kind of numbers that economists generally, tend to like having to talk about it being a progressive tax scheme. I'm not going to make a comment on whether that's good or not right now, but the progressiveness of that, of course, is very much far from what the reality here is. In terms of expenditure, so I'm showing here two types of expenditure. In blue is non-interest recurrent expenditures, that is daily expenditures excluding interest, and in red is the capital expenditure. Non-interest recurrent expenditure is not really rising a lot. Despite the salary increases, it's not really rising a lot. Effectively, it is rising a little bit, but it's not a lot. So in rupee terms, it's rising more, of course, as a percentage of GDP. It's not because the GDP in rupee terms is also growing. The big increase here is, of course, capital expenditure. But what has happened usually in the past is that capital expenditure is budgeted for higher numbers and then cut down at the end when you don't meet your revenue numbers. Like I think Danush said earlier, what was it? I think the kind of, I think it was about 45 to 50% increase in revenue expected from 23-24. If they don't really meet that, which is, it should be a very significant increase if they are able to actually achieve that. What has usually happened in the past is that you cut down capital expenditure. And here is mostly infrastructure driven things. Sometimes you could argue that's related to election spending as well. So whether it can be cut down this year is then again a question with the election coming up, all of that, right? So there isn't a lot of expenditure increase is the point that I want to make here. And this is in the context of the fact that Sri Lanka's economy has not exactly really been a high expenditure economy for quite some time. I think the last time that we even had these two expenditures, which are the real proper expenditures that we are talking about, as about 20% of GDP was again, I think the 80s, I think it was. So it's been quite, and it has been falling ever since. Our expenditure as a percentage of GDP has been falling, partly to do with the fact that GDP has been growing, and that expenditures haven't been growing at the same rate that GDP has been. So and something I mentioned earlier that I don't necessarily know, as my personal opinion, don't necessarily know whether it's right to say that Sri Lanka has an expenditure problem at any point. Perhaps maybe a better way to think about it is that Sri Lanka might have a expenditure allocation problem, because perhaps, a lot of these salaries, but even more than that, where those salaries go to, someone can easily argue that there are better ways to spread that salary burden across as well. So not going to go into too much detail. I think I have about 5 minutes more and I don't have too many slides to go through. So I think I should be fine. But total expenditure of the government, budgeted expenditure, is still rising. The big reason for this is, like Danush said as well, interest is rising quite significantly. The numbers I have are slightly different for the past than what he was referring to, but broadly, I think the point is that we are talking about an increase in interest cost. So I do want to add a little bit of context to something that was said earlier, in that while this 8.4% is largely domestic interest, it is not largely domestic treasury bond interest. It is largely treasury bill interest. So that is a separate point which complicates the treatment of those in any debt restructuring. I did have debt restructuring as a subtopic, but I'm not going to focus on it too much here. But that is it's a question, because treasury bills are short-term debt instruments that the financial sector functions on. So the question of whether debt restructuring can even work on those instruments is a separate thing. And that's separate to the discussion that happened with the domestic debt optimization that Sri Lanka did do. And that was not even, I think, something considered at that point, but just trying to add a little bit of context onto that. And like Professor Sirimal also said, there's this additional little bit of state bank recapitalization, not actual expenditure in that we are not spending new money on that. We are essentially accounting for that in the budget because these are essentially bonds the government issues to make sure the state banks are able to function. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because I don't know how technical this point is, but I do want to point out there was a lot of questions about, I think, around the budget about the huge borrowing limit, a large increase in borrowing limit. The government is borrowing so much more. In reality, the increase was less to do with actual new borrowing, but rather to do with the way the 3 trillion on restructure, there's a 3 trillion increase as a result of the ISB restructuring. So again, it's an accounting entry. It's basically when you restructure some debt, you retire it and you then reissue it. So you need to have legal space to reissue the debt. And like I said, the state bank recapitalization is also not any actual borrowing. You're just, placing a bond. So those are accounting entries as opposed to actual borrowing. The real borrowing limit is in terms of the 3.9 trillion that's left over, but that excludes treasury bill principal. I'm not going to go into details of that because I think that's beyond the scope of this, but there can be a little bit more borrowing overall. So, and that is, like was discussed earlier, I think a point to think about when you're moving into 2024, because the debt burden, particularly domestic debt burden, is not something that is still small. And that is definitely something to consider and something to be aware of as we go ahead. So the government is targeting this primary balance, essentially the revenues minus the expenditures, excluding interest costs and excluding debt costs. So essentially, whether you can meet your the government can meet its daily expenses. Excluding the state bank recapitalization, it's a deficit. But like I said, it's not an actual payment that's been made. It's just an accounting thing. So you can exclude it, and that is generally how it is done. Then the government actually does the primary balance does go into surplus. That is, you are actually making meeting your daily expenses. So that then becomes less of an issue. So to kind of sum this up, I will use these two slides. This slide shows the IMF's primary balance targets. Now, again, we can argue, we can just agree or disagree about whether the IMF is the right pathway, whether these primary balance targets are good, bad, useful, harmful, all of that. I'm not going to get into that. But the very fact that these targets are there, and we'll likely have to at least try to meet them in the short to medium term. Now, we're talking about moving from 0.7% deficit in 2023 to a 0.8% surplus in 2024, and then continue to even higher surplus over the next few years. That's going to be a challenge, and around and after an election season, that's going to be very much a challenge. So how that will go is something then to think about. Like was said earlier, this is also just a budget that sets the foundation for future budgets as well. So how that goes is then something we'll have to wait and see. I will end with a repeat of this quote from one of our reports. There is, like we said, no real free lunch, but you now have to pay for your lunch. So the question again is, who pays? Is that fair? Were there other things that could have been done? Were those other things perhaps good but not practical? Perhaps practical but not good? Who knows what that outcome would have been? So I think even in the next section, there are additional points that can be discussed. And even as we go on, happy to take any questions later. So thank you for having me, and thank you for listening to that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Damsinghe. Ladies and gentlemen, now that we've heard from all three of our panelists, their various stances and opinions on the matter, let us now move on to the second round of discussion, where once again, each panelist will be able to comment on the views expressed by their fellow panelists, provide any additional information regarding their views if they wish, and ultimately provide their stance on the matter. I look forward to the discussions that we will have in this next segment of today's event. However, just a kind reminder to the panelists that for this segment, you will each have a duration of 10 minutes for this round. Once again, alerts pertaining to the amount of time remaining will be given via the chat box. First, when 5 minutes have elapsed, the second, when 9 minutes have elapsed, and finally, the last one, when all 10 minutes have elapsed. We can perhaps start according to the order with which we went earlier, and also just a kind reminder to the audience to keep sending in your questions via the chat box. With that in mind, Professor Abeyratne, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Vibhath. Also appreciate Danush and Chayu's remarks about the budget. I would like to take this 10 minutes also to discuss about more little longer term program to realize our longer-term budgetary outcome. Even the IMF expects that we need to have a primary surplus, 8% of GDP in 2024. So far, so many years, we had the primary account deficit, which indicate that we are not able to even to bear our day-to-day expenses. So that the government revenue should be big enough to come to that level. That means to meet the daily expenses without borrowing more. So in the coming years, the IMF has provided primary balance targets. And with that, we need to improve our budgetary situation. In fact, that is one of the important area that we need to handle carefully when we also talk about economic recovery. In fact, what I want to talk about here is the taxation, because there is no way out of this budgetary impasse that we have been experiencing for many decades now. There is no way out if we don't look at the better budgetary management for the coming years. What do we mean by better budgetary management? First, we take the indirect taxes. In fact, the government is this time too targeting indirect tax increase with the increase in VAT, and it has been passed in the parliament today from 15% to 18% increase. And we should understand that there is a limit for indirect tax increases, because in a crisis like this situation, and already the government income tax revenue has gone down in real terms because of the contraction in economic activities, including the subdued aggregate demand. So further increase in taxes, how do we say that we are going to increase our aggregate demand in the coming year? Of course, we have an estimate to turn our economic growth from negative minus figures to positive figures. So with that, we expect that there should be an increase in aggregate demand, so that the increase in VAT from 15% to 18% will have a positive impact on government revenue, which is still too early to predict about this outcome. So that in fact it's a kind of a gambling, and we are putting our risky cards here, trying to play without knowing what is the outcome in the coming year. But also I look at that the indirect taxes on international trade, and I have mentioned this quite a couple of times in various forums. You can also check on taxes on international trade. And in fact, those data site, including the World Bank's World Development Indicators, give some indicators and compare our taxes on international trade as a percentage of total tax revenue. In fact, it is one of the largest in the region, which is an indication or indicator of that, to say that Sri Lanka is no longer open economy. Rhetorically, we always say that Sri Lanka is an open economy, but compared to many other countries in the region, in fact, the most of the countries which are doing well, you can get this ratio between 2 to 4%. That is the trade taxes as a percentage of total tax revenue, 2 to 4%. But in Sri Lanka, in 2019, that is even before the crisis, it was closer to 18%. In India, it is about 4.5%. So we can see that Sri Lanka is no more an open economy. And in fact, we have been contracting our economy in terms of our international integration. In fact, Asia is the largest free trade area today in the world in terms of population, in terms of expanding trade deals. Asia is the largest, but in this integrated Asia, Sri Lanka remains an isolated country. So having said that, I remembered one thing more, something different, because a couple of days ago I saw this top 40 business persons, and also their business companies in Sri Lanka. I don't know how I didn't go into details to look at that, how it was decided that these top 40 businesses in Sri Lanka. When I go through the list, I realized the main economic problem of this country when we look at the economic growth rate. That is, in that list, you don't find exporters. In that list, you don't find exporting manufacturers. Even manufacturers, one or two, but all of them are either financial sector entities or domestic market-oriented entities, which means actually Sri Lankan top businesses are either in the financial sector or looking at the domestic market sales, not the international market sales. So, which is an indication that Sri Lanka is also not an open economy, which is trying to integrate with the rest of the world. Taxation, again, coming back to the same point, which I think Dhanush as well as Chayu mentioned about direct tax revenue. I don't understand why we are so reluctant to implement a direct tax system. The main problem is, because when I look at many other countries which are having very efficient direct tax system, they have the system. Today you have the required technology and technology-based systems to know people's income, wealth, as well as in some countries, even the expenditure. In Sri Lanka, the government does not have any system to know people's income and wealth. It's all voluntary. Okay, I am voluntarily coming forward to pay direct taxes to the IRT. That has been our approach for so many years. Last 2-3 days, I was with one of my friends from the Netherlands, and he's also an investment advisor there. So that we were talking about this voluntary direct tax payment, and he was laughing at who is going to come voluntarily and pay direct taxes. And there should be a system, technology-based system, to understand for the government what is our income and what is our wealth. And then accordingly, government knows each and everyone how much we should pay taxes. But we are reluctant. We are inviting people, okay, 18 years old and above should register with the IRT. In fact, in this budget, I have seen further step forward. That means if you're going to open bank account, all these formal things, and then you should have the TIN number, tax identification number that you should have taken from the IRD. So that is one step forward, but still it is voluntary. Still, the government does not expect people to be in a tax base, in an information system, technology-based information system, to count to report and record their income and wealth. Without that, you cannot go into an efficient direct tax system in the country. That is where, in fact, we had enough time to at least to initiate this program. We are in the crisis now about 2-3 years, and we should have initiated that program. As we initiated Aswasuma, using the new technology system, we should have initiated many other things also. And these days, well, I will keep it for later discussion, and because of the lack of information for the government and why the government is so reluctant to implement it. We can understand in the past it has been reluctant, and even now it is not fully implemented. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor. We are very appreciative of your insight on the matter. Now, let's switch over to Mr. Danush Pathirana and hear his perspective on the matter. Mr. Pathirana, over to you.
Thanks a lot. So in this, I would like to say a few things about the debt and taxation, as my two colleagues also spoke about the same issues. So one thing I think we should know right now is that we are all living under an IMF program. Well, the government has pushed us down this path through their handling of the economy and everything else, and specifically in a way that we have subjected ourselves in a what we call a Washington consensus of very free market oriented IMF program, which was in fact initially not the approach of the IMF itself. If you look into their initial 2022 report and also the more recently released 2023 March report, they were more in line with a more open for a post-Washington type of a program, which they invited the government to bring out their proposal, which the government had zero proposals to address or to intervene where the market has failed, which they have given that those liberties to enter, but our government has not been able to do that. We are very much happy just let our broken markets handle everything. But since we are short of time, I don't have time to actually go into that. But let me just say a few things about this second review and how the budget has responded, whether and something about debt, because Professor Sirimal earlier said that all of us are actually responsible, and so on, that because we have been using these government utilities at subsidized prices, which were subsidized using debt, and so this debt crisis, we never complained, nobody took onto the streets to protest not to borrow, and so on. So that that is to say that we are all responsible. But so I just want to reflect a bit whether that is the case. Before going on to that, I'll just say a few things about the IMF demands and possibly how these demands are constructed, and that they are more in line with a type of a post-Washington consensus, and in a way that it has critiqued the market structure itself and how the government relates to these demands. The second review. So from the first review, I think the protest movement which the trade unions have organized since the first review have pushed IMF down that path from Washington to post-Washington consensus type of a framework, pushed down in the second review. But it remains to be seen whether they are just doing that to satisfy or just douse the flames, or just to pacify the type of unrest that is very much alive among the public, whether they will actually stick to these demands. So the demands are now second review. They asked the government to raise the tax revenue. Now, how did they ask to do? They didn't ask them to whack indirect taxation or inflationary indirect taxation, which would further erode the real incomes and increase the production costs and deteriorate our export competitiveness. So this will have a very detrimental impact both on SME, the so-called SMEs we have. They are not capable of transforming an economy. Nevertheless, they employ people. So in a humanitarian perspective, that this will have a detrimental impact, the tax policy what we have. And even the larger manufacturing firms who are exporting. But still, they are also, I think even Professor Sirimal would agree with me, that they are all very labor-intensive processes, incapable of transforming an economy as a whole and increasing labor productivity and therefore wages and living conditions. But the point is that the IMF demanded that the increase in tax revenue should be done in three ways. One is that streamlining the tax administration of direct taxation. That is to say, expanding the tax net who already don't come under the direct taxation. So what the government did was the exact opposite. They have expanded the tax net on indirect taxation. So now they have brought more goods and services into the VAT system. So so they have expanded the commodities and services that will be subjected to VAT. So exact opposite. And more importantly, the IMF raised the issue of tax evasion, because the issue of tax evasion is so huge that it actually contributes to this debt issue, not just what was suggested earlier, because it is estimated that it's around 144 billion, and the present value should be even more. And the issue is, like Professor Sirimal raised, that now in direct taxation of corporate taxation, the corporates get to estimate what they needs to pay. Now you and me, when you go to the market, we can't say what the amount of taxes I would want to pay when you're buying something. That is in terms of indirect tax. But there is the exact opposite treatment, so unequal treatment, when it comes to paying in direct taxation. You get to decide or estimate, this is my amount, and what they do is they present a value, and then they later disagree with that and then go to courts about it. And so this whole legal process and the framework of indirect taxation is framed or is structured in a way that it's very easy to get away from paying. So which the people who have the means, they exploit it very well. So this has resulted in the debt issue, because when the due taxes are not collected or paid, government will have to resort to borrowing to meet the allocated expenditure. And secondly, the tax breaks given for BOI firms. These were the demands. I'm talking about the IMF demands in the second review. Now, none has been addressed in the budget. So, so they are dragging us back into the Washington consensus, where it is more draconianly market driven, where the broken market system is supposed to fix everything, where itself is broken, the market itself is broken. Now it is giving them the burden to fix the entire the problems in the economy. So it's the government that is dragging us down. But to clarify, I'm not saying the IMF is serious about these demands. So it is remains to be seen what they would do in the second review, whether they will approve or not. So none of these has been addressed, because BOI firms account for 70% of the exports, which means a large section of that sector is excluded from taxation. That's what the IMF is saying. So you collect those taxes, but that is not addressed. And thirdly, lastly about the debt. Now there is huge issue about ODS debt, because this is where I like to disagree with Professor Sirimal, because trade unions have been campaigning against increased borrowings, especially there is a Auditor General's Department's report which very clearly states that roughly around 67% of the debt that was borrowed for financing government projects between 2006 and 2021, they have been spent, which is close to about 8 trillion. Only 2.7 trillion of that are shown in government books as assets. So 2/3 are missing. So then are we to blame for all that? So how is a government or a public supposed to finance this debt when the debt that was borrowed during this period has not been utilized in a way that it could generate revenue for the government and the broader public? So 2/3 of that is not reflected in terms of assets. Now, what we know is that when a government borrows for certain projects, that entire borrowing will reflect in the form of an asset, because even for if it's paid in the form of wages, that value itself is added to that whatever construction or whatever form of asset or utility that was established, that itself transfers into the value is transferred entirely for the into the asset column. So it should be equal. There can be a gap between the expenditure and the value of the assets, but which is it is the complete opposite in terms of Sri Lanka. And the Auditor General's very specifically highlights this is because they have over invoiced and completely embezzled this foreign debt, and it has not been utilized in a way that the public would benefit. And so what we can say is that if the government has borrowed in a way that the public is burdened, they are not liable to pay this debt. And there is what we call the odious debt concept. So I would like to wrap up with that. I would like to disagree that we all are part of this mess which has been created, because clearly this was initiated and created by the governments which ruled us over the past few decades, and hand in hand with the conglomerates who benefited through this public expenditure. It's not just the government, because these government projects are carried out through private sector firms, specifically these firms that have a greater connection with the political establishment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pathirana. The points you raised are definitely areas to ponder upon. But finally, let's turn our attention to Mr. Chayu Damsinghe. Mr. Damsinghe, we're eager to hear your thoughts. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Again, I'm very glad to do this after the two panelists before me, because it sets a very diverse series of opinions for me to follow. Makes my job a little bit easier here. I was initially planning for this 10 minutes to not address anything that was said earlier and just give an alternate perspective. But there is one point I do want to bring out, but I will bring it within the perspective that I don't want to integrate it instead of taking it separately. So the perspective I want to bring about is, again, understanding, and for how I understand personally Sri Lanka's crisis, Sri Lanka's economy overall. And for me, the story doesn't start anytime soon. And, we can easily move it back to, the 40s, 50s, whatever. But we can even move it well before to do the impact of the Great Depression on Sri Lanka's agricultural economy. We can move it to earlier on how the colonial financing mechanisms help drive a very particular type of export economy in Sri Lanka, and the instability of it as well. But instead, I will take a snapshot from the 1970s and 80s onwards, and then draw a little bit of a story from there. So from the 70s and 80s, what I really want to talk about is a more global story, where from the 70s and the 80s, particularly until about 87, the global economy was seeing a situation where what I call global liquidity was increasingly tight. That is, effectively, the global economy didn't have a lot of money flowing around, mostly because of risks in the economy, inflation in the global economy. All of that was resulting in a situation where pockets of money were keeping it locked down without making it access to other people. So that's not necessarily a question of being an evil person, just a financial decision someone makes, the risk of one's money being lost, all sorts of things. There's no one evil person who did this. It's just a combination, an aggregate of all sorts of things everywhere. So you had the situation of global liquidity to be quite tight. And then from the late 80s onwards, you had this situation where global liquidity started being boosted. Right? And you saw this, and I think probably the best way to look at this is to look at a chart of global interest rates from the last 100 years or so. You can see global interest rates tightening until about the 70s, 80s, and then starting to fall. The proper increase in liquidity actually happened in the late 80s, at around 85, as I recall, 85 to 87, as I recall, where essentially, I mean, I think the simplest way to think about it is a global money printing happened at an increasing scale, first small amounts and then later larger amounts. The impact of integrating China into the global economy was also part of what kept prices low and prevented the money printing from resulting in inflation in real goods and services. Lots of things happening, but effectively a lot of money was there, new money that was there in the global economy that hadn't been there in the past. So what does that matter to a country like Sri Lanka is that from the mid-80s onwards, and you can see this in Sri Lanka's own foreign inflows, you suddenly start to see this uptick, this very sharp uptick in the kind of money that's coming into Sri Lanka. Essentially, global investors, global banks, global pension funds, even global individuals, global firms, all of them now suddenly have a lot more money and global interest rates are falling. So what do they do when you have money and your interest rates are falling? You don't want to keep it in the bank. You're looking for more and more attractive places to invest your money in, right? Now, first, for Sri Lanka as a relatively underdeveloped country, right, at that point, low income country, that doesn't come directly to Sri Lanka necessarily. That came channeled through the multilateral banks and the like. So I'm not going to go into the mechanism there. But essentially what happened is that money is flowing into countries like Sri Lanka. So both governments, banks, all sorts of people are able to send money, have extra money that they're able to send to countries like Sri Lanka. And that happened across the 80s, that happened across the 90s, and then it accelerated at 2 points. First, in the early 2000s, when Sri Lanka was making the graduation from being a low income country to a middle income country, that graduation was happening around that point. And as you could see that happening in Sri Lanka, the structure of that changed, and Sri Lanka started having more access to commercial borrowing. Now, Sri Lanka first borrowed an ISB in 2007, and that's the second around that point, the second time that this increased. But even before the 2007 ISB, Sri Lanka still did access commercial markets separately on like private placements. And I think the earliest big one there was in 1999. We got, I think, about $500 million. I think it was. In 2001, we got another, I think, $250 million. I might be wrong on the specific numbers, but there was money coming in from private sources from that point onwards. The tsunami was another point where there's a huge influx of money that came into Sri Lanka. And you can see the difference that happened when you look at Sri Lanka's depreciation trajectory. The currency was depreciating on average about 7% a year from the point of the currency was first let go in the 60s, in the early 70s to 2004. And then from 2004 onwards, the average depreciation slowed down to 5% a year. That's not because from 2005, suddenly Sri Lanka started generating more dollars. It's just that globally, there was more money that was coming into Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka had access to more dollars. It's just not our own dollars. Inflows, investment, loans, all of that, right? I personally don't agree with this idea that investment is good, loans are bad, because investment is also made one day with the intention of taking it out. So I'm not particularly... I don't see a very big difference. I think both of those are money that comes in and then money that one day tries to go out. So I don't see too much of difference in that necessarily. But you saw that happen. So what does all that money coming into Sri Lanka from the 80s mean? It means that Sri Lanka's governments don't have an incentive really to worry about fixing too many things on the ground, because you don't need to worry to fix your budget deficit, because you can run a deficit, you can get some money from abroad and you can bridge the gap. You don't need to worry about building up a production-based or building an export economy or whatever your decision or import substitution, whatever your ideological direction is. You don't need to worry about any of that, because you can just get some dollars and you can import whatever you want and you can live a good life. And that also did allow across the point to those subsidies to barrel up. Now, the problem is not necessarily those subsidies barreling up, not necessarily the fact of those existing, but the fact that those are financed through borrowing across the point. So there is where I would disagree with, and I will add my disagreement with the point made by Danush, in that I think the foreign borrowing and the impact on the local economy is very well documented. I think what the Auditor General's report talks about is the dollar value of the debt compared to the rupee value of the assets which of course depreciate. So I think that's the discrepancy there, as opposed to some missing amount of debt. We do, I think, have a very clear record of what happened from each year. If you look at the central bank reports, we have very, very clear indication of all the imports, exports, money that you out. All of that is very much there, the capital inflows and outflows. So I would disagree with the ODS debt characterization there. But essentially what that resulted in is a lot of imports that Sri Lanka's population was able to really have. So I feel, for me, the way I understand it is that as a lot of this money comes in, governments don't really have an incentive to grow or fix problems on the ground, right? Regardless of whether the problem is a corruption problem, regardless of whether the problem is economic policy, regardless of what you think the economic policy is, when you have money flowing in from abroad that solves all your problems, that hides all your problems, you don't need to deal with that. I think that is one way to understand it, because this is what the story of Sri Lanka's economic crisis is not unique to Sri Lanka. It has happened in multiple countries across the world. More recently, you might have heard about countries like Ghana, countries like Turkey, countries like Argentina most recently. Again, similar stories. Money flows in. There's no incentive to fix things on the ground. You spend that money, and then eventually you end up in a situation where at any point, and why that blows over into a crisis, is that at some point you end up in a situation where the money is like, look, those guys have taken so much of their money and they're not doing anything that will eventually give us back any money. So we're probably going to stop giving them extra money. So they're only going to give them the absolute minimum needed. And then suddenly that country is no longer able to sustainably continue. So for me, the debt side of thing is related very much to that story. So for global liquidity, for me, is a big part of it. And it's part of the reason why, for example, from, let's say, I think it was from 2009 to 2016, if I'm not mistaken, there was about $6 to $7 billion worth of foreign exchange intervention in the local market, and money, essentially $6 to $7 billion that the central bank spent to control the currency, to keep the currency stronger than it otherwise is. And the benefit of stronger currency is cheaper imported goods, of which the chief one that Sri Lankans consume is fuel. So cheaper fuel in terms of point of export, but then also then subsidized at the point of consumption. So all of that again financed through foreign borrowing on one end, and at varied points in the past, local borrowing in terms of money printing as well. The ability of the big pool of money in the EPF to also help the government is also very much part of it. So for me, the way I understand the crisis is not one where I consider any one person or any one actor to be a cause of it, but rather a continued interweb, an interplaying interweb of co-evolving factors that have really driven the situation here. And it's not a Sri Lanka specific situation. It has happened in other countries across the world. Of course, we have taken actions that have exacerbated it, sped it up, worsened it at very points. But I don't necessarily think it's a Sri Lanka specific thing. I think there's a big global co-evolution of factors that have led into that. So then, while we can take action on the ground in Sri Lanka to kind of resist those factors, I think we also have to be aware of those factors. So if we continue to get more money from abroad, then it doesn't, again, we don't need to fix any problem that we have, because money comes in. Thankfully, it looks right now, thankfully from one perspective, not thankfully from the other, that there is not a lot of money coming in right now, not just as a result of the Sri Lankan situation, because global situations are quite tight once again. So how that goes about in the future is something we will have to kind of wait and see. Hopefully it turns out in a way that is positive for Sri Lanka. But on the other hand, it might not necessarily be something that is, one of these, very strong, growing, booming economies, but something that will eventually one day end up being quite all right. Right, thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Damsinghe. What a mighty fine discussion that was, wouldn't you agree, ladies and gentlemen? All right, as we draw towards the end of the second round of discussions, let us now transition into our dedicated question and answer session. We have currently received a few questions already through the chat box specific to certain panelists, so why don't we look into them? However, if someone else from the panel would like to share their thoughts on the matter as well, please feel free to do so. First and foremost, we have a question up for Professor Sirimal, and the question reads, we talk a lot about taxation and other policies, but it's also important to understand that Sri Lanka is home to a huge informal sector. So without properly identifying this sector, how do we effectively implement certain policies, especially things such as direct taxes? Professor? Professor, I believe you're muted.
If I understand the question, Vibhath, then it is about how to implement the direct tax system effectively.
Considering, just a moment, Professor. So considering that there is a huge informal sector, not necessarily just direct taxes, but how can we implement certain policies, such as direct taxes, when we haven't really identified this informal sector that exists in Sri Lanka?
Yeah. Good question, because direct tax system has basically primarily there are two. One is the corporate tax system, other one is the individual income tax system. And obviously, this is not a short-term thing, but our economic crisis, we have been living in this crisis also for about 3 years right now. So with that, those 3 years are long enough, I think, for us to initiate something new. And what do we have to initiate? Looking at other countries where we have successful direct tax system, that is the technology-based database system which records each individual of the society. So we have 22 million population, and which is not a big number. For a country, there are billions of people in some countries, and so hundreds of millions of people in some countries. So countries have implemented various technology-based systems to understand, to record, to report, and to update every year about their income and wealth. So individually, each and every person's income and wealth can be recorded in this system. And we can learn from other successful countries how they are implementing it. So that is one way of doing that. And it is also one way of capturing part of the informal sector also through the individual recording system. The second thing is, of course, it's a digitalization. And in fact, we are moving into a digitalization. There are policies and there are committees now at the looking at digitalization programs for Sri Lanka, and including AI policy and all these things. But actually, certain things which are implemented right now, when you look at them now, a couple of days ago, we got a form here from the police, and according to 1865 police ordinance number 16, we are supposed to provide household information to the police. And now in a couple of days' time, the census department is also sending us another, collecting our information. And IRD is also collecting. So you can see duplication of information which can be recorded and centralized in one place and then shared by many different government agencies, including the IRD, so that the digitalization of the system is the modern, one of the important ways to capture the direct tax system and establish a broader tax network. Secondly, your question about informal sector. Obviously, informal sector has to be captured to the modern organized sector, and that can also be done by recording with the. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. Moving on, there is a question for Mr. Pathirana, but before we proceed, Mr. Damsinghe and Mr. Pathirana, would you like to probably add on to the answer that Professor just gave us a little while ago? No, no worries. So, Mr. Yes,
yeah, just to quickly respond to Chaya about the question of ODS debt and the global money printing and so on. Yes, the global money printing, in fact, started with the establishment of the floating exchange rate system after the collapse of the Bretton Woods, where the dominance of the hard currencies was established later on, and so they were able to basically engage in this type of money printing without adversely having an impact on their BOP to a certain extent, because they have a greater the currencies have a greater weight when it comes to purchasing power of their imports. So they could rely on money printing without necessarily having to worry about their production structures, which have already been evolved and with industrialization that have been strengthened. But then again, that the point about the money being coming into parts of countries like us, I think the problem is not so much money coming in, how this was utilized. So the ODS debt component is very much alive, because the Auditor General's department report and the department itself very clearly states this is not because of the exchange rate fluctuation which happened over the years that there is an imbalance between expenditure and assets. Now they clearly show in each year, 2006, what was the amount of expenditure, what was the amount of assets. So it was a yearly accounts which they show. So they have taken into account that this whole depreciation of the currency that does not come into this picture. It is irrelevant. The fact that they have what they have clearly stated is that the expenditure have been massively inflated. Now, for instance, if I give you an example, now about the Southern Expressway expenditure, now that is around roughly $6 million per kilometer, the expenditure they have allocated. Whereas now that was in 2011, mind you, 10 years ago, roughly 12 years ago. Now in 2021, if I'm not wrong, or 2022, there was a highway project which was completed between Saudi Arabia and Oman, and the production cost of that was 0.9 million USD per kilometer. So almost 6 times lesser than Sri Lanka. After 10 years, if you factor in inflation, this will go up to about 7-8 times. So there is clear misappropriation of debt by inflating the expenditure. This is very clearly documented in the Auditor General's report. So it has nothing to do with this exchange rate fluctuation over the years. That is to account for the difference between expenditure and assets. So there I would like to highlight that. And secondly, I'm sorry, I couldn't follow the question you were raising. You asked me a question from the audience. No, I couldn't follow it. Just wanted to respond.
No, that's all right. I don't believe I voiced it out just yet. But the question reads as follows. Don't you think that the current crisis in Sri Lanka is not merely an economic crisis? If one says that it is a political crisis in which the economic crisis is only one facet of it, what would you say?
Yeah, now as Chayu rightly pointed out, of course, now this is not just a crisis that Sri Lanka is facing. This is sort of this is the common reality which the entire underdeveloped world, or what we can call the third world economies, are right now facing. So it appears to be that the state structure of all these economies are more or less the same. They are the patron-client relations with the business sector, the conglomerates which they have specified to carry out their own projects. So, and the political financing system, how the government, the political parties are financed by the conglomerates, and how later on the government projects are actually structured or enacted in a way that rather benefits these people than the public. And so in the long term, progression of these activities would inevitably lead to severe debt crises. And also I want to highlight the fact that what the IMF governance diagnostic is highlighting, even in their executive summary. So they have corroborated these facts which the Aegis department is making, and they're making the further point that most of these embezzled or misappropriated foreign debt has exited the economy. They have not remained in the economy. So, and that the government is not making any legal measures to actually pursue to take legal action against these individuals, or maybe in the both government and also the business sector who are engaged in these activities. And that area is actually so huge that it has a significant bearing on this crisis, without in fact going into the structural issues of the economy, where our production structure remains very primitive in terms of technology, labor intensive, so incapable of self-expanding on its own and multiplying more technologically advanced production on its own when it comes to the private sector, because they are mostly gone into what Professor Sirimal also mentioned, mostly finance and so on. Non-tradables account for 70% of the economy, GDP, and even the rest of the 30% that are exportable have centered on labor-intensive type of production, where labor or working capital dominates in the capital composition, not fixed capital driven by automated machinery and so on, which have a positive impact on labor productivity and therefore wages, and also it has a tendency to expand the scope of goods that an economy can produce. Whereas if we focus on things like garments and so on, assembly work, it does not have the capacity to multiply or take advantage of scientific developments in a way that it is happening in the developed capitalist economies. So these impulses are in fact beyond the scope of our production structure, and our production structure remains incapable of absorbing these things. So that is the core structural issue which the government and the private sector should address in, I believe, sort of like private partnerships, private-public partnerships, or direct state interventions into industrialization. So both that can be discussed, how what should be the proper way going forward. But what I need to highlight is that this problem of odious debt is very much real, and these numbers are being corroborated by the respective departments and even the IMF, and that this is not something specific to Sri Lanka and other underdeveloped countries, specifically Africa and South America. Now, IMF itself recorded that around 30% of the GDP by the time when the Argentinian economy was collapsing in 2001, 30% of its GDP was outside was outside their economy, and so these things do play a big role when it comes to crisis formation. And so to answer that question, just to wrap up, yes, definitely the political structure is very much part of this issue, and this political structure is not something specific to Sri Lanka. It seems to be, there is a common element that is present in all these third world economies, so that the crises that they face tends to be more or less similar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pathirana, for that very detailed answer. We now have a question that has been directed to, obviously, Mr. Chayu. And the question reads, Abeyratne Research presented 10 budget proposals last month. 2 out of the 10 proposed the following changes. A, increasing the withholding tax rate, and B, introducing property taxes. Do you think that these are sensible proposals?
So I can't actually comment on very specific proposals for obviously that's a little bit of a factor that I can't take. So I won't answer that broadly, but what I will say is broadly, if we agree that Sri Lanka needs to increase taxation revenue, that has to be done in a way that is fair, that is practical in that it actually brings revenue, but it's also something that doesn't lead to a situation where context result in reversal. So I'm not going to comment on the specific reversal. I'll just make a quick point on, I think, Danusha and my disagreement here. I think our disagreement is on what the facts are. So I don't think there's too much of a point on continuing that discussion here on this platform. So we'll not continue that comment here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Damsinghe. Now, before we proceed, we do have a few more questions. However, if there is anyone in the audience who would like to, let's say, vocalize their question, you are more than free to do so. Please, once again, use the raise hand option. And let's probably wait a few seconds and see if there's an individual who has a burning question that they would like to ask. Really? No one? Well, all right then. I mean, time is of the essence, so let's not waste it. But we do have a few other questions, so let's get to that. And this question is directed at Professor Sirimal. And the question reads, even if the expenses of our country increase, the probability of the income increase is low. So how will this situation affect the budget get compared to the previous year's budget?
What was the question, Vibhath, again?
Of course, Professor. So the question reads, even if the expenses of our country increase, the probability of income increase is low. If so, how will this situation affect the budget gap compared to the previous year's budget?
Yes, this is very much interesting outcome that we like to see in the coming year, because always we have overestimated the income estimates, income targets as in the past, and this year also I can see that. But we also have a positive economic outcome projected right now, which is not a negative economic growth like this year. So these are the revenue growth is always, it is based on some of these assumptions, and which might be possible, but there is high probability that they may not be realistic as well. In that situation, obviously, there are going to be an increase in budget deficit, and some of the expenditure items will have to be slashed down. So this is not a new issue actually, and this a specific issue right now because of the economic crisis. But throughout the last couple of decades, we have seen the same issue. But another related things, because I must leave now, I already mentioned, is to Tilini. Before I leave, I must also mention this, that stability is only part of the problem, and that the stability has to be maintained with economic growth. And that economic growth has to be supported with the policy reform process, which is much longer term program. The stability now we are trying to achieve with these budgetary arrangements to support, to establish our financial stability. But however, it has to be maintained, but without economic growth, without export growth, that stability may not be the realistic one in the coming years. So that we need to focus more on that attention. Thank you so much. And so that, excuse me, I have to leave right now.
Of course. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for your time. We are truly very grateful.
Yeah, good night.
Good night, Professor. For the interest of time, once again, why don't we take just one last question and probably move on with the rest of the agenda. Now, there is one question that has been sent in. It hasn't been specified to whom they want it answered by. So let me just read out the question, and from the two panelists here, whoever would like to take on the question, please feel free to. If both of you would like to give your thoughts on it, that's also welcome. The question reads, it appears that a large amount of concessions have been given in the budget presented after an economic collapse. Is it fair and feasible to give concessions in this manner? If the question needs to be repeated, please let me know.
So I'll give my perspective. Danush can chime in if he wishes to. I don't personally agree that a lot of concessions have been given in the budget. I think the increase in salaries, I think, is the one big one. Beyond that, there haven't really been a lot of concessions. And of course, some of the tax changes weren't actually in the budget, it was outside the budget, and that's a procedural problem. I think that's separately something to think about, why that doesn't happen through the budget process itself, why it had to happen separately. But I don't think that a lot of concessions were actually given, and I think even Danusha mentioned earlier that the increase in the tax revenue that is budgeted from the increase in VAT and everything else effectively covers the cost of the additional increase in recurrent expenditure that happens as a result of the salary increases in particular. So I wouldn't agree with the characterization that there is a lot of concession happening in the budget. The question for me is also really, is the balance there that is, one, fair for the economy? I'm not going to answer whether it's fair or not, but because two, I think the question is whether there was any practical alternative. When I say practical here, what I'm talking about is not, oh, if XYZ worked out perfectly, then we could have had this issue, or if we did this other mechanism, or if the government took this other decision, or if, the corrupt people were not there when something else could have been done, because those are all part of the reality that we live in, right? So the fact that, for example, let's take, and I'll give one example of that, is that I think there's supposed to be wealth tax coming in 2025. Again, how much of that will be implemented, what the response to that will publicly be, how that will be framed publicly is a whole other question. But I'm sure there will be people who resist that. There will be people who resist that within government. There will be people who resist that within bureaucracy. There will be people who resist that ideologically. There will be people who realize that they supported that and then now they are affected by themselves and therefore they had to figure out a reason to resist it. All sorts of that. So none of those are wrong points, right? Like people will resist something that affects them negatively and support things that support them positively, right? And that's part of how people act. So I think all of that is part of the practical reality. So then does that mean government shouldn't do that? No, I think what it means is that there are some aspects, some measures that are practically possible to implement. Let it be due to the particular balance of resistance versus pushback that is possible at a certain point, right? For example, remember, government needs parliamentary approval to put some things in place. Perhaps some things, it is easier to get parliamentary approval than for other things. Now, is that fair? Is that good? That's a different question. I think the question of pragmatism is separate to the question of morality. I'm not personally going to answer or even address that question of morality, but I do recognize the question. I think it is the policymakers that do have to consider those questions because that's part of their job description. But in terms of concessions given this budget, I don't necessarily think there was a lot of concessions. Arguably, could have said there might have even a little bit more space to give something, particularly on the welfare side. Perhaps there was more space to give something, and that space wasn't taken into account. So maybe there could have been reallocation that made more sense. But I wouldn't agree with the characterization that it was a very, giveaway budget.
Thank you very much, Mr. Damsinghe, for that very elaborate answer. Mr. Pathirana, are there any thoughts that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, well, I completely agree there with Chayu, and also would like to, what he, I think, initially raised about the issue about allocation. Now, for instance, the expenditure could have been reallocated in a more productive way if we leave out that question about addressing the economic structure about this concessions and social safety spending. Now they have allocated around 450 billion rupees into highways and so on. These this seat of corruption, as we may call it. There's so much of evidence and information about this happening and a part of our debt crisis. So they are just liberally continuing the same expenditure. While now there's some people are, as this question also suggests, that they are concerned about the concessions. There is what we can also show that the spending on to agriculture. Now, there is great misappropriation of these funds also, whether they are productively used. About 120 billion is allocated, was allocated last year. Now this says slash this year by about 10 billion, if I'm not wrong. And so obviously, as a ratio of expenditure from the GDP, that has come down drastically. And right now, we're in a huge humanitarian crisis where over half of the population is facing this, what they call multi-dimensional vulnerability. So in such a situation, they have reduced the expenditure into food production. And how this expenditure is used, I think that is the more key component. What the farmers say, recently we had a meeting with the farmers in Polonnaru. What they say is, now they say 100 billion and so on was 10. Nothing goes into the hands of the farmers or to transform the agriculture base what we have right now. There's so much they can do in terms of agronomy, improving the agricultural practices. What more that improving the farmers' technological know-how and their scientific applications into cultivation and so on, which increases the productivity and also brings down the cost of production. Both good for the farmers and for the consumers right now who are living under extreme poverty. So these things are not mentioned in the budget, whereas they are even cutting the expenditure which they are misallocating into food production. So I completely agree with that the concessions are not enough. Even they will amount to nothing or even amount to negative when we look at the tax proposals, because as I think I mentioned earlier, the marginal increase in the taxation would amount to a monthly increase in tax expenditure or tax collection from each worker up to 13,500 rupees a month. But as we know, these concessions don't even come close to that. When we take the broader the population, and even if we just take the public sector workers, their salary increase will be negative if we take the tax increases, disregarding the tax, the hyperinflation we experience, and then those prices are now maintained. Now government is actually boasting about bringing down inflation. That does not mean anything, because the prices which increased over the last 1.5 years has remained at that level. They have not come down. So of course there is a limit to which these prices can increase, because there is so much of unemployment, demand has come down, factories are closing down. So now even at that level, we should expect the prices to come down. But what we see is that the prices would further increase with this tax policy going forward, creating a stagflationary situation. So as my colleague Chayu rightly mentioned, the concessions are no way enough, and this will aggravate this. The situation will aggravate with these proposals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pathirana. All right. Well, that's about all the time we have for this question and answer session. I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who sent in all their questions, and we apologize if we were not able to facilitate some of them due to time constraints. I'd also like to give our 3 panelists a big thank you for their time and expertise. Now, while unfortunate, we are moving towards the end of today's event. I would like to thank all the panelists for their insights, opinions, and views on the matter that has allowed us to gain a truly multidimensional view of the situation, one which is truly very important considering the status quo of the nation. To progress forward, however, I'd like to pass the floor back to my good friend, Shihara. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Vibhath Jayasinghe, and it was a privilege being your moderator for today's event. Shihara, over to you.
Thank you so much, Vibhath, and thank you so much for the panelists as well, and Professor Sirimal, who left us a short while ago. With that, we are coming to the very last segment of today's discussion. So to wrap things up, I would like to first and foremost invite the project co-chair for this discussion, Thirini Kodikara, to deliver the vote of thanks. With that, over to you, Thirini.
Thank you, Shihara. Hello, everyone. The success of this event was not only possible due to the collaborative nature of all our partners, and recognizing them and their contribution is of great importance. With that in mind, I would like to express my gratitude to Sri Lanka Association for Political Economy for collaborating with us and ensuring that this event become a reality. Today's fruitful discussion was definitely enlightening. On behalf of the Economic Student Association of University of Colombo, I extend my heartiest gratitude to panelists. I would also like to take this moment to thank to Dean of the Faculty of Arts, University of Colombo, Professor Asantha Manawadu, the Head of the Department of Economics, Faculty of Arts, Professor Chandana Aludge, Senior Treasurer of the Economic Student Association, University of Colombo, Mr. Umesh Moramudali, and all the lecturers and non-academic staff for your utmost support and guidance in making today's event success. Also, a big thank you to the Economic Student Association, University of Colombo. Thank you so much for your hard working in putting together today's event. Finally, a massive thank you goes to today's audience who joined with us for this valuable resource. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Thirini, for that vote of thanks. If anything is an example, this discussion was a compilation of all the hard work from the organizing team, as well as support of the lecturers and Department of Economics at the University of Colombo. So with that, I would like to draw close to the discussion. I would like to thank everyone who joined today and for hoping that you can take away something important from this insightful discussion. So with that, I would like to sign off. This is Shihara Ferdinando, and hope you have a wonderful night and a wonderful week ahead as well. Thank you very much.
Good night and thank you.